Welcome back to another Waynos Photos Cameras video, and today we're going to be talking about 24 frames per second, the proper frame rate or the cinematic frame rate, or is it? And that's what this video is about. So let's roll the intro and let's have a talk about frame rates. What are the pros and cons for all the different frame rates, and should you be shooting in 24 frames per second? Now, the first thing we need to cover about frame rates is something that's driven not by the camera or not by your creativeness, but by where you live. Because if you live in North America, their frequency or electrical frequency over there is 60 hertz. And if you live here, where I live in Australia, the frequency is 50 hertz. Now, the problem with that is if you don't shoot that's in a frequency that divides into those electrical frequencies, then you get flicker in your video. So if I'm here and I've put mine in 30 frames per second and I go inside and I've got a light on, all the light's going to flicker. I'm going to pick it up. So what you do is then I shoot in 25 frames per second instead of 24, and the flicker goes away. It's the same in America. If I'm shooting in 25 frames per second, I'll get flicker. So I can change to 30 and then the flicker goes. So you need to align your region to your frame rate groupings that's in your camera. And generally the cameras, you can set them to NTSC or you can set them to PAL, and they'll automatically regroup you into the right region. So that's the first thing you need to do with your frame rates. So they can say cinematic all they like, 24, but if you live where I live, you've got to shoot in 25 as the minimum frame rate, which is would be the equivalent of 24. So as I said, the first thing you need to consider is region. Now, two is panning. Now, panning is something that it depends on how you shoot and what you want to shoot, because with 24 frames per second, you've got less frames per second. So if I'm panning my camera across like this and I'm moving slowly, I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, up to 24. And if I do that in a second, I'll get 24 frames in that pan. Now, if I move much faster, right, and I'm going from here, I'm going to get less frames in that pan. Now, it gets to a point where you start to see the jitter. It's not just blurry, it starts to jump and jitter. So for every frame rate, there is a maximum pan speed, and there is actually charts for that. So if you like to use those lower frame rates, or you want to use those lower frame rates, you need to consider your panning speed, unless you're going to start to get jitters in it. Okay, so the third thing is higher frame rates. Now, why would you shift from your base frame rate from 24 or 25 up to 30 frames per second or 50 frames per second or 60 frames per second? And the reason why you would do that, depending on what you're filming. Now, if I was filming a couple of lovers on the beach, it's a beautiful sunset, I might choose to use 24 frames per second. I want it to have a bit of a softness to it, and as the camera moves, it gives a bit of a soft look. But if I was filming someone playing baseball, then what I'll do is I'll use a higher frame rate, because it's capturing more of the content. There's more frames in there, so you can see the bat swing, you can see the detail of the ball hitting the bat, and that is the subject of the video. So you want to make that the information that you're passing to the viewer, you want to have that more accurate, so you use a higher frame rate. And that's pretty typical for when people play computer games, or even when, Fox News or so forth film sport, they do it at a higher frame rate. So you picking the frame rate based on the subject that you're actually filming. Now, 4, we have motion blur at lower frames per second. So the benefit of using a lower frame per second is if you have a lot of transitions you're using and you're trying to blur one clip into another, with a lower frame rate, there's less frame rate, so it can hide your transitions easier. The more frame rates in there, you're getting more detail, like I was explaining with the sports. And what will happen is that you can see that transition, or that thing where you're trying to change it from one picture to another. It might not really fit or align properly, or you're trying to zoom in to make it all fit. It doesn't line up properly, and the viewer may be able to see it, whilst on a lower frame rate, it's easier to hide. So that's an advantage if you want to, if you're doing that type of shooting. You might choose a lower frame rate to allow you your artistic choice in the transitions. Now, number 5 is your equipment. You might choose your frame rate based on your equipment. Like you might want to shoot at a high frame rate, but if you do, then you're going to have some disability with your camera. So a lot of cameras, if you go to a higher frame rate, like I'm shooting in 50 frames per second now, but a lot of cameras, if you do that, you might have a crop. Or the quality of the video may be slightly less, and you may not want that. You may want to keep your higher quality video, so you don't want to go to those higher frames. You want to keep it on lower frame rate. So your equipment could actually make your decision for you when it comes to what frame rate you want to use as your base frame rate. Now, 6, this is the main reason why I shoot as a base rate in 50 frames per second, because social media apps are not all equal and they vary, and certain social media apps have a upper limit of 30 frames per second. Other apps like YouTube seem to be able to adapt to any frame rate, but some applications, for example, Facebook, and I shoot in 50, if I upload 50 into Facebook, it'll get a jitter. Whilst if I film it and upload it in 30 frames per second, it runs completely smooth. It looks better. So you may choose your frame rate based on the medium that you're actually going to display that video on. So let's just say you were going to display that video on Facebook, and that's the medium you're going to put it on. Then you'd optimize your frame rate so it looks best on that medium, because I can tell you right now, they vary, and I've played around with this. Instagram has improved their quality in recent times, and they do seem to accept better frame rates. Like there was a time when if you uploaded 4K to Facebook or Instagram, it'd just make it look all mushy. Whilst now they seem to have changed it, and you can upload 4K to both Facebook and Instagram, and it looks really good. And especially if you put it in 30 frames per second, it really runs very smooth and looks very crisp. So you may optimize the way you film and the resolution and the frame rate depending on the medium that it's going to be sitting on and people are going to be viewing it on. And the other thing that I've found as well is if you use a higher frame rate, this is more so for YouTube, not Facebook. For YouTube, if you use a higher frame rate like 50 frames or 60 frames per second, I've found that you tend to get less artifacts. Because there's less frames, when it gets compressed, it tends to break up a bit, especially if you've got transitions where it's fading from one clip into another. You can see it. You can see it kind of, it also, the compression starts to break up the picture, and you can actually see it, and I don't like that. And when you shoot in the higher frame rates, it tends to mask that to some degree. So I don't know. I seem to be able to see those things very easily, and I also see the jitters very easy. And that's why I very quickly moved away from 24 frames per second, because I can see the jitters in the 24 frames per second. It doesn't seem to play well on social media, 24 frames per second. I don't know why people recommend it. If you was delivering it on a different medium outside of social media, maybe, but I can see it. When I watch 24 frames per second on social media, I can see it jitter like this, and I don't like it. It turns me off straight away. So some people, maybe they don't see it and they think that 24 frames per second looks beautiful, really smooth. That's fine, but I won't shoot in 24 frames per second. So guys, you need to pick the frames per second and consider all of these things that I've said. Don't just switch it to 24 frames per second because someone on YouTube or somewhere has gone, oh, that's the proper frame rate. That's the cinematic frame rate. That doesn't mean a lot unless you're making a blockbuster movie that's going to be seen in the cinemas, because we're not. We're putting it up to a medium that someone else owns and is optimized the way they want to, and you need to fit in with that optimization. Well, anyway, guys, that's where I'm going to leave it. Let me know down below, what frame rate do you shoot in? Do you see the jitters? Is there something that you can add, or another reason why you shoot in a different frame rate? Leave it down below so we can share it as a community. And that's where I'm going to leave it, and I'll see you next vid.